are religious images and idols, and how does the Old Testament speak about them? Why is the second commandment so important to Christians? This is what we're going to be dealing with on today's Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. And to discuss this issue, we have Old Testament scholar Michael Thigpen with us today from Phoenix Seminary in Arizona. My name's Anthony Costello. I am the president of the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics, where we bring the best of Christian scholarship to the church to equip the saints for engaging with the culture. Today, I'm also joined by Dr. Jacob Daniel, my colleague. Jacob, how are you doing today? Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience for us?
I'm doing really well. It's good to be here on the podcast again. And I'm fellow with Kirkwood Center for Ethics and Theology, and I also direct a project called Heritage Council. The focus is to advance the transforming truth of Christian faith and promote its excellence in public life.
All right. And our expert for today's topic, Dr. Michael Thigpen. Mike, how are you doing today? How's
I'm doing well.
Sunny Phoenix, Arizona?
Actually, it's cold today.
Really?
But I mean, which, cold for us is it's in the 50s.
Brutal.
You get used to it. But so we think about July when it's in the 50s and then we feel better.
Polar vortex there for you guys right now in Arizona. Mike, tell us a little bit about where you're at, and also how did you get interested? I know you kind of had a previous career, I think, before this, but how did you get interested and focused in on Old Testament theology specifically?
Sure. So I'm professor of Old Testament at Phoenix Seminary, and I've been teaching OT things for a little north of 30 years now, as I like to tell my students, because I'm old, and that's what I do. Originally, so it was very providential. I've always loved the Old Testament, but the very short version is God and I were having an argument when I was in undergrad. I said I didn't want to teach. I'd be happy to be like a medical missionary, and he would be happy with that he would like that plan. Shockingly, he won that conversation. And so in undergrad, I was at the University of North Carolina and asked what I could do that would be productive before I went to seminary with this undergrad at what is, more or less kind of a pagan university. And they had a religious studies program. And one of the key features of it was it offered 2 years of Hebrew, biblical Hebrew. And I took Hebrew at that point with men I had no idea were leading scholars in the world of Hebrew, Jack Sasson in particular, who's now at Vanderbilt. And so the Lord just opened up my access to learning the language at a deep level early on. So by the time I went to seminary, I was already there, and profs there took me further. I had one in particular who just would read with me each week in the text, and we would continue to learn. And that fostered my love. I was hooked at that point really on the language and then on the beauty of the Old Testament. And so that's really where it began. It goes back to my undergrad days.
Wow. So but you're suggesting that sometimes we have to wrestle with God about what we want to do and what he might want us to do instead?
As long as we recognize in advance that he is going to win that argument.
Right.
You can be young and dumb, but it's just going to work out his way. So
And I think
I'm very grateful for his patience.
I think it encourages young people as well. It's better to be nudged by the Lord and be placed in the place where he wants to use you. And that's beautiful.
Exactly. And I look back and I'm grateful for the whole thing.
Exactly. It's a good way to start, actually. I mean, it is something I think we all struggle with. I don't want to make light of it. It can be a very real struggle for all of us. We think we really want to do one thing, but then we realize the Lord is pulling us in another direction, and we have to go down that direction at some point. Oh, anyway, we're glad you're here. Here's one of the reasons that the Lord pulled you in that direction, so we could answer some interesting and maybe difficult questions about the Old Testament, and we thankful that we have you with us today. So we wanted to talk first. We're going to do a couple sessions with you, Mike, but we wanted to talk. This is something that I started to dwell on a little bit more as I was working through the JPS commentaries, which I think are fairly robust set of commentaries, Jewish commentaries, not written by Christians, but by the Jewish Publication Society. And this idea of images, the uses of image, which in one sense is such an obvious theme, right, in the Old Testament throughout. But then I wanted to talk to you about, really get a little bit more into this. What is the second commandment really telling us about the use of images, the danger of making images either of Yahweh or maybe even of other gods? So maybe you could just start us off with kind of an overview of the issue, the topic of images, and how it relates to idolatry in the Old
Sure.
Testament.
So I think we actually have to back up and look at the first commandment and make sure we get it in its proper setting first. As we traditionally understand it, we should not have anything else before God in terms of primacy, those sorts of things. That's an absolutely valid interpretation, but it's not what it means in its first instance. The term that's used both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy to say you shall have no other gods before me is a spatial term. And literally, what is being commanded there at its most basic level is ordinarily in the ancient Near East, when you go to war with another country, your goal is not only to defeat them, but you want to raid their temple, take their idols, bring them home to your temple. And so your God's idol will be placed at the highest point. The other captured gods would be placed lower. And it's a way of creating a visual pantheon. So in its first instance, as Israel's going to go into the promised land, they are not allowed to think of what's happening as I'm now gaining additional deities under the control of my God who will serve as a little pantheon. And so that's ruled out. Now, by extended application, yes, we should not have anything that is before God, anything that is greater than him. And that could be all sorts of things that we might idolize now or even then, like power, wealth, other things like that. But it's no pantheon creation out of the idols that you might steal. So this is why we get the destruction of these things along the way as you get into Canaan. So then what you do is that flows then into the second. So not only can you not take them, but you should not be making any idols. And that would cover two things. First of all, you're not supposed to make idols of other deities. And I think that is what's happening in the golden calf incidents in Exodus 32, because Aaron doesn't say, behold your God or behold Yahweh. He says, these, plural, are your gods. And what they had requested was make gods, plural for us. And we know that it's plural there because the verb itself is plural, that they might go out before us. So we don't know what happened with Moses. We don't know what's going on with Yahweh on the mountain while he's gone. So make us another set of deities who can go out before us because we're in the wilderness, supposed to go to the promised land. So we need some power that's going to affect this for us. So it's really going after that. But there's also a sense in which you cannot make anything that is to represent God that is visual in nature. God says, look, I've never shown myself to you. He's all right. They hear him. He appears in cloud and fire, but he is not the cloud. He's not the fire. And so I've not ever given you a visual to tell you how to think of me in that way. So you're not allowed to do that either. And both these really are at heart, right? If you think about the basic creation, we are to have dominion over everything that's on the earth and represent God as a vice regent. We are here connected to him, reflective of him. And so we're supposed to administrate this world as his representatives. When we take a created thing and flip it over like that, what we're doing is saying these things we should be administrating are now over us. And so we're elevating the things that are actually lesser than us and lesser than God because he's creator. We are not, they are not. And then saying these things are the source of life. And so in that way, then we're kind of reversing the creation order and then I think what happens is we create God in a way that we have control over. Idols must be worshipped. They require offerings. The
Yeah.
basic quid pro quo in the ancient Near East is you give me food, I give you blessing in terms of the sacrifices that are made. God says, no, cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. Even if I had a need, I wouldn't tell you. I don't have needs, but I wouldn't tell you about it because you can't do anything. So this is the basic premise. It's keeping the creation order. God is creator, us as his representatives, other things is what we are to administer on his behalf in their proper places, representing him as the creator of all and us as his only due representatives on earth. So I think that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah,
Oh, well,
Michael, do you see a parallel there in the book of Genesis itself, right in the very beginning? That's exactly what's happening. We see God, man, woman, and then the creation. Whereas we see Satan taking up the form of a serpent, animal, gets to the woman and then to the man and wants to subdue God in some sense.
Exactly. And so he takes up a form which they should have control over, right? They're to have
Mhm.
dominion over all these things. They fail even in terms of their relationship with each other, because we sometimes forget this. We have to remember she gave to her husband who was with her. So it's not like she ran from the serpent and said, "Hey, I have this thing for you," and he has no idea what's going on. He's been hanging out silently with her for this event, and not intervening. She's not intervening. He's not intervening. So it is a complete flip of the
Mm.
creation order as it should be taking place, and that's exactly what's happening in those early chapters of Genesis.
It's good. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. I had like 5 or 6 main points there that you brought out, but that's great. So the first point I think you made was the idea of literally placing idols of other gods next to, well, in the same place as Yahweh, after say like the conquest of the land. But then sort of just declaring that Yahweh is maybe in some sense just above these other gods, which I think there's the term maybe is often called Henotheism, that Yahweh is maybe one amongst other gods. He's just maybe more powerful in this sense. So that kind of be one. So one thing that uh, the biblical revelation is clarifying for us is that Yahweh is not just one amongst other gods, right?
And and it's challenging because the Old Testament is going to talk in two ways about other deities. You're going to get places like Deuteronomy 4 that are going to say Yahweh is God and there is no other. So, at a category level, there is nothing else that is genuinely like him in the universe. But in other places, it's going to talk about the gods as though they are real. They are entities that exist and that are worshipped. So even Paul's going to talk about this in 1 Corinthians 10, I think it's verse 20, when he
Mm-hmm.
talks about this food that's sacrificed to idols. They're actually sacrificing to demons.
Right.
And so there are entities that are not human, but the text will say in the most clear places, but neither are they truly God. We
Mm-hmm.
use this term, God, for them, but they're not the same. They're categorically different than God is, but you still think of them as God because you're there. So we have to think carefully. The clear statements are there's only one God, the Hebrew term Elohim or El. There's only one of those. But you have this other category of things that are greater than you. They're immaterial in that way, that they're not humans running around. And so it's going to both say you worship things you call gods, but they're really not in the same category.
Right.
And so we have to keep this sort of, it's a balanced position that the Old Testament gives us. There is the reality. People worship things, and many of them are real things. And there are entities, spiritual entities behind them. But they are still categorically different than God. And so it's kind of keeping all those things straight.
Right. So maybe to put some philosophical handles on it, we'd say that these other beings that are called gods by people are immaterial, perhaps, but they're finite, they're contingent, they're created beings. They're not omnipotent. They might have some power. They have maybe agency, but they might have some knowledge. But they're not. They don't have any of the omni attributes, right? And more than anything, they are not. Like I said, they're finite and contingent. They're not necessary beings. They were made. They were made by God ultimately. They're not transcendent in that sense. So they did not pre-exist the creation. Just
Correct. They are themselves creatures, which is why they will be judged for the role that they played in opposing God and his plan for his people. And then you do have a more sort of I think of Isaiah or Jeremiah's critique, where okay, there are real entities out there that people worship, but there's also just the level where you take a log, you take half of it, cook your dinner on it, the other half you carve up and you make an idol out of it. You
right.
make it pretty with gold and jewels. The last thing you do is nail it to the floor because
Mhm.
otherwise it will topple over. So here you have this image of you're worshiping something that can't even hold itself up. So you kind of get three levels. There is a sense in which sometimes you're just worshiping nothing but your own creation.
Right.
Sometimes you may actually be engaging with an entity that is less than God, but different order than us.
Yeah.
And then you really have the true God, the only God that exists. And so you kind of get these three levels described in the Old Testament.
Yeah,
Michael, would you
that's
say
interesting. That's good. Yeah.
would you say it would be a violation to even because nowhere in the scripture do we see, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we see a spiritual having interference in the affairs of man without taking some physical form, that would be a violation, because time and again, even with God, we see he appears in the burning bush, he's coming as angels, and even the Holy Spirit has been seen as coming down as a dove, and God
Right.
becomes man, Jesus, to save mankind. So even with spiritual beings, would it not be a violation unless they take some kind of physical form? Because that's the only way out in terms of any kind of interference.
I think that's probably right. So we have angelic beings that engage with humans. So we have, the angels who show up to Daniel, or say to Zechariah and do interpretive things. John engages as well in the Revelation, though ultimately he's going to engage with Christ directly. And so they do appear. I think what I would say is that what is always clear in the scriptures is when an entity other than a human represents God, that allegiance is made clear. They come as messengers who bring, so they, just like human messengers represent the king, they come as divine messengers who represent him, and their allegiance and voice is clear. And so they function in that way like a prophet, right? One of the two tests of a prophet, Deuteronomy 13 is, if they're talking and giving you a message from any other God, that's a prophet who's illicit. So that's a clear violation. So any spiritual entity that is not representing God and in conformity with what he's already revealed, that's the other part of Deuteronomy 13 and 18, the two tests of the prophets, is God's not changing directions here. He's staying, his character is the same through. So it would have to be in his name and then in conformity with what he's already revealed, which ultimately anything that's illicit will not do that, because they're not trying to take worship to God. They're moving in other directions. So we would look similarly towards those tests for the prophets in Deuteronomy 13 and 18, the same way one might assess spirits in the name of the Lord. In this case, now even in the name of Christ is where we are operating, and then in conformity with what has been revealed in the Scripture.
So, Mike, let's do this. There's now that's gonna bring me to a couple other questions about maybe we need to talk about the making of images of things like angelic beings,
Mhm.
and whether or not that is a profitable or a detrimental act. I don't know. Of course, there's a long history of imagery in the Christian and the post-resurrection era, right? Of making all kinds of images, and I want to get to that difference between, because I think there's a lot of contemporary debate still over whether or not we should be making images of Jesus, even, right? Before we do that, I want to go back to Exodus and the incident of the golden calf. I want to get clarity on that because I believe you said that you did see this as a breaking of the first commandment, not so much the second commandment. That what Aaron has in mind, and the Israelites have in mind, are other gods, not
Which I think
rep-
breaks one and two.
right. It would break both. You're
Some
right. Right.
understand it as only two,
Okay.
and understand that the calf is supposed to represent God. And so,
So
what would be illicit about it is not the changing of worshiping another deity, but the change in worshiping God in physical form through a calf. That does happen in the Old Testament. But I think in this case, the plural verbs that are used and the way that's both requested and presented by Aaron indicates that they're breaking one and two. They are worshiping other gods,
right.
and they're worshiping those gods through idols, and both are not allowed.
Yeah, and I
And
guess
I,
the reason why I wanted to get clarity on that is because some people, I think, in the Christian era have and still will get nervous about breaking the second commandment if we represent Jesus in any way, or God the Father. We think of like maybe some great work of art, the Sistine Chapel or something, where God the Father is represented as the old man in the sky. And of course, we have a multitude of images of Jesus. And then people have been more creative with the Holy Spirit. Think of like Bernini Bernini's chapel. It's the dove and the cloud and the light, right? Because those are the images we get. But so we wouldn't say like, well, obviously those aren't breaking the first commandment. But I think it raises a question a lot of people said: Are we transgressing in any way there against the second commandment? And I think it is an interesting question, and probably comes from the right kind of place.
Maybe
So,
a connection could be made, just the very after giving this commandment of not creating any brazen image, the next thing we find is actually the Ark of the Covenant with angels around it.
Mhm.
We do see the images of angels in the Old Testament
the
being
cherubim.
made. The cherubim, yes. But I also think that there are two more commandments that might be that the people are breaking at the time when they built the calf. One is that they attributed deliverance to the calf, not to Yahweh. That it was calf that brought them out. And I think in that regard, they were taking the Lord's name in vain and having a feast around it. And the next, I would say, is the last commandment: "Thou shalt not covet." Just I think they were coveting because other people had gods, so they were making that connection that they have gods, we don't. So we
And
have to, yeah.
So,
I think
Michael,
you're exactly
two
right. So
things there: the
yeah,
angels, and then the images, New Testament era,
sure.
post-Christian era, of God, or the Trinity, or Jesus, or one or more members of the Trinity. So,
Yeah. So let me, I think you're exactly right, Jacob, in that you get similar language in Samuel when the people go to Samuel and say, we want a God. We want a king. Part of what they say is we want a king who will go out before us and fight our battles. That language is language that's used of the deliverance of God for his people in coming out in the Exodus. And it's used of the idols here, that we want them to go out before us. And God says, this is replacing me, not you. So Samuel, this isn't about you. So I think you're right on that language that's there. In terms of representing God, I think we have to remember a couple things. One is God has already represented himself in us, right? So the language that's used, we are in the image of God. Humanity, male and female, are created in the image of God. So he has chosen one authorized image of himself, and it is humanity. Now, the greatest then illustration of that is the God man himself, who is the express image of God. And so he is most fully human because he is without sin. So he's not as we are, broken as we are, yet he is also fully God. And so he comes as a different order of representation of God as true humanity, but also as true God. And so if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, he will say of him. So we do have authorized images of God. And so we need to think of that he is willing to have himself represented, but only by his choices. And part of that is us. So we're to represent a connection to him and a reflection of him in the world through our activities authorized in Genesis 1:26-28. And then Jesus comes as the express image of the Father. So he's spoken in all these other ways, but now he's spoken in him. So I think it's challenging. With Jesus, I am relatively comfortable representing him in human form because that is how he came. He was disclosed to us and disclosed the Father to us in a human form, just as we disclose God if we're, representing the image of him that's there. So I think that's sort of implicit that there's not much of a way if you're going to do any kind of pictorial representation. Jesus had physical form. Now we can get in all sorts of questions about, right, do we, anglicize him, and that becomes an
right,
issue because that's not what those are
cultural
kind of
questions.
separate
Yeah.
issues of making him in our image then at that point. But I think that representation, many would say, is fair and legitimate, not a violation of the commandment, because he came in that image
Right.
and was seen in that way. Most would say the artistic images of, say, the Spirit as cloud or fire, right? Isaiah 61 and 63 are going to talk about the Spirit in the cloud and fire in the wilderness. Obviously, we see him as represented as a dove. And then all the images related to wind and the movement of that happens, that language is used of the Spirit. So those kind of representations seem okay as well. They're consistent with the word pictures that it goes. And none of those violate, in my mind, the first or second command, because the first command is about who you worship. And if I'm representing Christ as a human in an art piece, and I'm worshiping Christ, then that's not. So the second commandment, though, I think is still not an illicit image, not an image that we ascribe to him. He's a bull, he's an ox, he's a snake, whatever it might be. And it's not a representation of another deity. So I think that's okay.
Mhm.
I am personally more uncomfortable when we talk about something like Sistine Chapel and the representation, say, of God the Father.
Mhm.
Now
Mhm.
that's challenging because, right, the Father does imply human imagery. He does occasionally represent himself in figure through the Son as a human, right? So there are ways in which that language is used. I'm just a bit less comfortable for that.
Yeah.
Representation of the angels, I think, is not anywhere prohibited unless we are ascribing to them some sort of deity or worship. So the point that we view angels as intermediaries, Colossians is clear. This is a no-go. There, Timothy, there's one mediator, the man Jesus Christ. So we would get into those kinds of places if we're illicitly using the saints or angels as intermediaries, then that's the bigger issue than whether or not they're represented in physical form.
Right.
And so that's sort of the direction that I go and how a lot of people would understand that. Now, some will just be more cautious and say we shouldn't have any representation of any of the Trinity. And I think that can be a faithful place to be. I'm not sure it's required by Scripture, but I'm looking at who are you worshiping, and are you casting them in an image that they have, that the Trinity itself is not authorized, like Christ as a human is the express image of God.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And I kind of, I mean, I resonate with that. I feel the same way. The Father certainly feel is the most problematic member of the Trinity to represent. And I mean, you can kind of even get a sense of the kind of damage that representations have done when people like, atheists like Richard Dawkins or some think of the great sky daddy. You can already kind of see like how that image has been put into sort of the collective mind or the social consciousness and is just utterly reduced God down to just, like some kind of Feuerbachian projection of ourselves. And
Yeah.
that's obviously then we got to kind of do apologetics against that,
And it wouldn't be a problem if you are a Mormon. They wouldn't have any problem representing Father in physical form.
Correct. Correct.
Right. That could open up a whole nother can of worms on why Joseph Smith did that. But okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, with the Son, we'd say, look, the Son had a body. This is a real Jesus. This is a human Jesus. This is a human. This is the God man. And of course, again, I think there's still always concern about then how we represent Jesus in the culture. What
Yes.
what what words do we put into his mouth? How do we make him, and so on and so forth. And maybe we'll have Doug Huffman on at some point to talk about his work on The Chosen,
Yeah.
which I haven't seen yet, but I know
An
there's
interesting fact, just to
possibility.
touch on this, I learned recently is that if you look at any of the icons and representation of Jesus in particular, especially among the Orthodox Church, you would never find a picture of Jesus without a beard. The idea was, but you'll find angels without the beard. So the idea was that God becoming man, he representing
Yeah.
himself as a man. So they want to communicate that idea through the way of the icon. So that's one of the ways as well. Pictures and idols, and it's more of a representation of who he is than it is that.
Yeah.
Mike, let me bring you back to something you mentioned earlier too, with regards to the images of other gods, small g, right? Whether they be powers, principalities, demons, angels, fallen angels of some sort. I think you mentioned this earlier about this idea is that with these other gods, spirits, um, there's this idea that we can control them. It's a transactional relationship, right? With the gods of the nations, we do X, Y, and Z. They must respond in kind, sort of, right? And I was reading, I think, can't remember. It was it was on the section of the rock at Mirabah, right, where Moses strikes the rock, and I believe I was reading Sarna's commentary on that, where he seems to suggest, and other rabbinical scholars had argued as much, that this wasn't about the reason why Moses was prevented from entering the promised land wasn't because he got angry, but that there's more going on there with the language about what Moses actually says about sort of maybe even like making himself the source of the miracle when he says, "Shall we," meaning like him and Aaron, "draw water out of the rock for you, you rebellious Israelites." And in that idea is that here is Yahweh trying to wean the Israelites off of this pagan culture that they had just lived in for hundreds of years in Egypt with the multiple gods and the idols and so on and so forth, trying to get them to recognize who God is. And Moses kind of does this act where obviously there's words there and there's a movement with the rod and everything that maybe looks more like something that the magicians would do in Egypt. And in so doing that, he has some kind of power or control over Yahweh, where now Yahweh has to respond. I mean, do you have any insights on that? Because for the pagan, this is the case, I think, right? The relationship between these other beings is a very transactional one, right? This is what magic is. If I do this, if I say this spell, this, and then the deity will give me stuff, basically. And I think it kind of, if we can get into a place there where, and I think we see it a little bit in the church today, it's in some places where we treat Yahweh, we can treat God this way, right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you reach a place where um, almost all forms of legalism come across as a kind of magic, right? So if I perform these things, I've checked the boxes in all the right places, then I am owed a certain kind of return on that. And so in the ancient Near East, that might look like giving your offerings to the deity, and that then ingratiates you to them, but also means they're on the hook because they need worshipers in order to feed them, to care for them, to do those kinds of things. So that's there. I think with Moses, I don't see that as a magical kind of manipulation. We get this little image of it with Pharaoh's men. It's actually not
Mhm.
that common in the rest of the ancient Near East. Most of what they're doing is divination, looking for information, and then trying to get in the way of blessing or out of the way of curse, but less actual sort of manipulation of the deities through an act like that. I think the representation there is that they've placed themselves, Moses and Aaron, as the ones who are actually powerful in providing this. Then a
Yeah.
little like Samuel, right? You're frustrating me. And God's like, this actually isn't about you. This is about their rejection of me. And I think that's a little bit of what's happening there with Moses. Moses probably gets a little bit harsher here than, say, Samuel's rebuke, because of the singular nature of the way in which Moses represented God, right? So, right, think about it. He's going to say, you are going to be God to Pharaoh. You're going to be God to the people. So you are going to represent me in this most direct way, which is kind of unique with Moses. Until we get all the way to Christ,
Right.
there's not much else like that, and so I think the rebuke here I would read along the lines of it's the improper taking on of the onus. I have to do this for you. It's so hard. Well, no, you're just representing
I
God
see.
and not caring for God's own reputation, that they are actually kind of going against him. And Moses is like, this is problematic for me. And he's not actually really thinking about the way that people are speaking of God. So you right, think about David when he gets there to Goliath. It's not about the king. It's not about the people. You have defied God, the living God you've defied. And Moses doesn't have that same perspective in that moment of you are defying the living God who brought us out. You're annoying me is kind of where he ends up.
Okay.
And I think that's part of what they go after him for.
Now, okay, that's good. That's good. That clarifies a few things for me, at least, on that issue. Now, let's wrap up maybe this session with one of the images that I think confounds some of us, at least as me, that is used in the Bible, and it's not necessarily an image of Yahweh, but is the employment of the brazen serpent or the brass
Mm,
serpent in the wilderness
mm,
after the Israelites rebel and the serpents come in and take out, I don't know how much of the population. There's this strange use, seems strange, it seems a little out of the ordinary given the rest of the text, of an image of a serpent that is then lifted up. And of course, we get um, a crystal. I mean, it's a typological, it could be a typological reference later for the New Testament authors. of being lifted up, and then the Israelites having to look at this image of the serpent in order to be healed from their
Yeah.
affliction.
I think there are a couple things that are going on here. One is it is fundamentally an act of faith, which is exactly how the rest of the Old Testament sacrificial system works, right? So the animal sacrifice itself does nothing for you on its own, right? If it's not done in faith, if it isn't enacted as I'm doing this because this is God's prescribed means of doing this, then in and of itself, it has no power. So you can do it illicitly and gain nothing from it. So it represents in the same kind of way, God has given a prescribed means of healing. And the language there is very deliberate. It's not just look at, so it's not just like I caught a glimpse of it and now I'm magically going to be healed. I must take this thing in and I must observe it because this act is the act that God has said is going to heal me. In that way, it represents death, right? Death has come in judgment, and I must observe this judgment in order to do that. And I think that's part of what's happening with Christ is death is coming. He is taking that death, and I must observe that in faith because it is his prescribed means, is my attentive gaze on Christ, my acceptance of his work as that. And I think it's part of how the typology works here. So I don't think it is just the way that it works. It's not like a magic ritual that's taking place, but it is unique. No, don't get me wrong. It is unusual in the Old Testament context in those kinds of ways to see that. But I think that's the parallel that's taking place.
And I think New Testament is very clear about that for our audience. If a very common passage, we think about the extent of God's love, John 3:16, for God so loved. But right before that, it talks about the brazen, the serpent. In this manner, that God so loved the world,
Yeah.
that whosoever
Yeah.
believeth in him shall not perish, but have eternal life.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right.
Now, Michael, maybe another thing then before we finish up on this is to think about maybe some of the images we do get of Yahweh, verbal images, poetic images that we get in like the Psalms, God riding on his chariot or across the sky. So, I mean, how should we understand those? And obviously these weren't then, they weren't supposed to be what's depicted in any way, but we do get the poetic images of Yahweh as well in the Old Testament.
Some of them are stereotypical images of deities in the ancient Near East. So, like the one who rides on the clouds, that's a kind of a Canaanite. We would see it in the Ugaritic literature. And I think part of why those are used is saying, look, if you want to understand who's really deity, right, he's God, there is no other, then they take some of those common language pieces and ascribe them to him in saying, look, he's actually the deity, not Baal, not El, not Shamash, not Marduk. All of these things belong to him. So if you want to stack up the ways people talk about what a God is actually like, they apply to him. So I think some of it is that. Many of them are nature in orientation and think about him as the one who who created and now controls creation. So he's the one that moves the sun, moon, and stars. He's the one who controls the host of heaven. He is the one that, stores the rain and the snow and then releases it. So you get these kinds of things that really then pick up on him as creator and carry that through to his providential control of creation now in the way that we engage with it. And I think those are the two biggest categories, are the nature of him as creator and us as creatures and how he engages with creation. But then also some of these stereotypical images of deity to say, look, if you want to know, it's not these other gods. He is God, and it's a way of making that claim, I think.
So, I mean, the psalmist, in a sense, there's some polemic and apologetics going on.
Yes.
Right. It's not these, it's this that you want to, it's Yahweh that you want to turn towards. It's Yahweh who is the true rider of the heavens and so on and so forth, and the clouds.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. Jacob, so any other questions or comments from Mike on this issue?
Just one maybe. how should we see this in terms of apologetics, in terms of in different cultural contexts? For example, I've seen missionaries go in and take these images and use that for the sake of the gospel. What's your comment on that? I mean, how far can we go with regards to using pictures, using idols, and representation of stories of the Bible, and even Christ? Sometime, where do we draw the line
As Protestants,
as
as
Protestants?
Protestants, I guess we should say, right? As evangelical Protestants.
So I certainly think things like the Jesus film, and things like that, where we have a narrative depiction of the stories we've been given about Christ in the Gospels, I think is certainly a valid way of thinking about presenting the gospel. So those kinds of things I think work well. Um, I think that mostly what we've been given, though, are verbal images, things to make us think.
Mm.
I think their usefulness is dictated by what's in the culture. So the culture doesn't have that, right? So, the classic illustration is, what if a culture doesn't have a lamb? Should I
Mm,
substitute another critter? The answer is no. I think at that point it's educational. I need to teach you what a lamb meant to them. Maybe I have an analogy. It is like this, but I'm not just going to substitute that, but I want to make those kinds of connections. To the extent that we might have things that are related to the sun, moon, and stars, to the heavens themselves, to the earth, and places where that culture might have a native expression of what God is like. Like,
mm,
no, actually look at the scriptures. They say this one is the one who is these things, and make exactly the same kind of move that the scriptures do of, you think it's this, but it's actually here. And I would do that starting with, probably, right, I'm thinking Paul here in Colossians with, okay, Christ is all. Everything that exists is from him. He is
mm,
over all things in his authority. And so then anything that you have that represents this, they fall underneath him. And so to make that kind of move more explicit with Colossians, and just, I wouldn't start in the OT, but I would work from Colossians backwards in that way, is I think
Yeah,
what I would
this,
do.
yeah. This question actually it came out of my concern for what I'm seeing in missions these days. There's a trend of orality, going to the way of the local languages and just capturing everything that's there and appropriating that. I think we need to stick to the word and what it teaches and be as proximate as possible and bring our cultures to the gospel culture in particular.
I think so, and we have to take the Old Testament and New Testament culture to them as well. And that while some things are easy to stand across, sort of all cultures, you can get there. There are other things that God chose those moments to disclose himself. So they're in particular historical modes, and we have to ask the question, why, and what does that bring to us? And so in the same way that we have to learn, I want to be, there is a bit of cultural snobbery here sometimes. We can learn these things, but why would we then not expect that they could as well? And sometimes that is
Mhm.
a that
Yeah.
that is a little bit
Mm,
of a take of, they're too simple, and I need to speak only in their language, when in fact we can do the same thing that happened for me. I needed to learn about what I wasn't raised with lambs. I don't know anything about them. I had to learn that.
yeah.
And so those kind of things, I think we need that educational process of why God chose this image, this moment in history, this culture to disclose himself in these key moments across the scriptures, and then learn those, just as we have along the way.
Yeah, and but historically, that's been a very hard thing to do. I mean, to discern what aspects of a non-Jewish culture can just sort of be appropriated into sort of like into the church, the local church, and which ones have to sort of be weeded out so that we have the right representation of God and Christ. I thinking about the image of Jesus again, and we have seen all the problems just recently with this idea of historical depictions of Jesus, and we just had a huge uproar in the critical theory crowd of social justice crowd of too many depictions of Jesus as the white European whatever uh uh male. But one of the it so that it does, those are real issues then that the church has to deal with. I always think of like one of the best I think ideas of representing Jesus was Lew Wallace's book, Ben-Hur, where he makes Jesus not a cameo, because Jesus is the central figure of the book and of the 1958 movie, but you never see his face, right? You never see his face. So it's like an interesting way to do it, where you just see the impact of Jesus's life on all of these adjacent figures around him, but all you ever see is like the back of his head in any of the scenes. But yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's the image of God is not something that we can take or deal with lightly. We have to think very hard and very carefully.
I think the tension is how do we actually make aware of like, people of the fact that we are somehow trying to make known the unknown God. That's where the tension comes in.
Yeah. And represent the God-man faithfully as well in the process. Well, Michael, this has been good. We're going to see you again soon on another topic, but thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. This has been the Theology Ethics Podcast of the Kirkwood Center. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics Podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.